everyone, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is GroundUp 101, a LinkedIn live recording to share the work that GroundUp Conservation as an organization is doing. So, just to get everyone started and on the same page, GroundUp Conservation is an impact based organization that is working with Indigenous people and local communities across South Asia to build resilience and financial independence through nature-based solutions since 2021. Today, we've been joined by two very critical members of the GroundUp Conservation team, Swapnil Chaudhari and Radhika Kothari, who will be taking us through the entire journey of setting up GroundUp Conservation, the vision they have for the future, and the work and experience that they have gained over the last 5 years. So, just to set some context about why we are all here today. So, this is our attempt to essentially convey the message of the story, the work, and our vision of how GroundUp Conservation is seeing themselves in the conservation space. We are envisioning that this will help us reach out to a larger audience, explain our work, and find other organizations that are also working in this space with a similar vision and would like to partner with us, discuss more thoughts, and essentially see how we can collaborate further and make the conservation space more equitable for everyone included. So just before we get started, there is a long list of questions that we have for our speakers today. But before we get started, I would like to mention for our audience, if there are any questions that you have throughout the entire time that we're doing these questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, as we have a team member who will be answering the questions as they come. So feel free to keep putting your questions in the chat box itself. Okay, so before I start with our speakers, I would just like to give a quick introduction of both of them. So, Swapnil Chaudhari is the founder and CEO of GroundUp Conservation, an organization which partners with governments, grassroots organizations, and development agencies across South Asia to advance community-led landscape management. With over 20 years of experience, he has worked with ICIMOD, UNEP, UCMC, BirdLife International, IWMI, and the Government of India, influencing conservation policies across the Himalayas. He holds an MPhil in Conservation Leadership from Cambridge and serves on the Biodiversity Credit Alliance Communities Advisory Panel. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Swapnil. Radhika, who's our second speaker. Radhika Kothari is the head of grassroots development at GroundUp Conservation. She brings over 18 years of experience in community-based conservation, climate resilience, and grassroots leadership across the Himalayas. Her strength lies in strategic planning, impact-driven program design, and supporting local organizations to build strong systems and capabilities. She is especially interested in approaches that integrate nature and culture, rooted in local knowledge and lived experience. She holds an MPhil in Conservation Leadership as well from the University of Cambridge, supported by the Cambridge Commonwealth Award and Robert Sanson Scholarship, and has been a LEAD Fellow and a Dalai Lama Fellow at the University of Virginia. Again, thank you so much, Radhika, for being here with us today as well. So I think we can just start a little bit by talking about the origin and the personal journeys of both of you that led you to GroundUp and starting this great organization. So the first question I have for you, Swapnil, is what was the moment or experience that made you feel that conservation needed to be done differently and ultimately led you to setting up GroundUp Conservation?
Thanks, Poorvasha, and hello to everyone who has joined and has given their very valuable time for listening to us, our experiences. Answering to your question, it was not like a particular moment as such, but over the past, ever since I joined ecology or environmental sciences or conservation through academic career, but also through the professional career, this field allows you to travel a lot and travel extensively. While doing so, as you were mentioning about credential of the organizations that I have served under, very often we work on project to project basis mode. The very simple assumption is that to repair the ecology, it requires a very long-term commitment. Forests, for example, those who work on restoration would know that even once you plant the trees, for those trees to bear the fruit and become propagating machine, it requires at least 10 years on an average, which means that any restoration you do, it's a commitment for 10 to 15 years. But look at the sectoral programs that are happening, right? They are usually in the gestation period of 4, 5, 7 years top. And beyond that, sustainability is always in the question. Everybody wishes to have all the interventions, all the innovations that they did to last longer than the project time frame. What is project time frame? When the money actually is emptied. So, hello?
I think
I think
Poorvasha has got stuck. Yeah. Let's continue. Maybe
yeah.
we'll...
So because of this sustainability at the center of question, many organizations are struggling despite of us having spent mammoth amount of investment in like development sector and also equally in the conservation sector. We are seeing that the challenges of biodiversity conservation remains as they were, or equally they have aggravated. What are these challenges of biodiversity? Biodiversity is the outer manifestation of ecological processes, which means that if the fundamental ecological functions and processes change, it reflects in change of biodiversity. Now, having said that thing, what I was also feeling is that recovery of biodiversity through the landscape management approach requires a considerable amount of finances, but it also requires a very, very solid partnerships. And given that the conservation or wildlife as a cause receives very, very insignificant amount of money as compared to other causes such as livelihood or education or health, we need to be extremely careful with the resource optimization. And how do we exactly do that resource optimization? We know that ecological restoration, which is what helps us to recover the biodiversity, is resource intensive. And biggest cost of that thing is restoration is as good as like civil engineering undertaking, which means there's a lot of labor, a lot of machineries that are involved when you're dealing with the land and restoring functionality of it. More the land is degraded, higher the investment that will be required, and so will be the time. To reduce because we have very limited resources, to reduce that burden, grassroots organization who are working with the local communities, indigenous populations, where biodiversity has still remained largely in a far better stage as compared to areas which are not protected areas, but generally just the open areas. In that area, local communities have quite a lot of detailed understanding on how to actually recover the biodiversity. So it's not only traditional knowledge, but the approach, the frugality of mindset, the innovation that they can deploy, and also a kind of time reference that they can provide as to when we are repairing the ecological functions, how would that reflect into the manifestation of biodiversity? What kind of species will take over? What kind of species will be removed? And if there is a target species, how do we exactly bring their population back? And in that, given their lived experience, who live into close proximity with this landscape, they are not only like a great contributor, but I think they are extremely important stakeholder who can drive a meaningful change, and also because it is in their interest. So all these things require a sort of consolidated approach to ensure the sustainability, that technically we are very sound. Local community take the ownership of the work that we are doing. And given that the entire process is going to take more than 10 years or so, we require a lot of contribution and sense of ownership among the people. And that's where it failed, that if we want to really challenge and address the biodiversity crisis, or currently people have started to call them as polycrisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, all sorts of consequences that comes along with it. Participation and ownership of local communities are important. But if that is the answer, if local communities are the answer, then what are the questions, right? We know that in development paradigm, very insignificant amount of money actually reaches to the ground. There are some information that has been published or has been cited that less than 1% actually global finance that is mobilized in development sector reaches to grassroots organization, which is kind of it just doesn't make a business sense. If we are to really see the change, we need to be very serious. And if we are serious, we need to look at ground implementation, its sustainability with a proper exit. And to do that, so we need a solid ground presence. Organizations which are based out in capital cities such as Kathmandu, Dhaka, Colombo, Delhi, or any other cities, we are limited by organizational procedures. We do not have so much agility. But grassroots organization, because they are so close to the ground, they understand socio-political, cultural dynamics of those landscapes. Meaning that they have lived there and they understand in what circumstances thing might not work. And this early kind of indication of where program will actually fail, that itself supersedes all sorts of risk assumption that we usually tag to the grassroots organization, usually with regards to their financial ability, managing compliance and things like that. So there's a tremendous opportunity that I witnessed, that the next scope of work will be, because climate change and biodiversity crisis is going to accentuate and everybody is feeling that way. We need to take the action, right? Who is going to take the action? Action has to happen on the ground or on the ocean. And these places requires proximate leadership. That's where grassroots organization come into play. And to address them, we need to mobilize more resources so that like that money actually goes into the hands of grassroots organization and their communities where they dictate, they decide what kind of solution we need to deploy. Of course, it requires tallying it with scientific know-how that advances that has been made in ecological restoration, landscape management. Also, in terms of technology adoption, earlier the cost of simple baseline surveys used to be quite high. Compared to that, like so much technology advances has happened, but that kind of penetration is not yet reached to the ground. It has still remained largely in the hands of like mega organizations, right? So to accelerate this part, this is where I saw that like there's a lot of opportunity because I personally feel that ground is empty and very few people are there. And even I personally, when you take a flight from one place to another place, you see like, if you just like peep through the window, grounds are so vast. And what is the largest of the restoration effort that has happened in India or South Asia? It's quite just a drop in the ocean. And that's where I feel like, there's a tremendous opportunity that actually can provide a considerable amount of finances, employment, and also we might be able to buy some time before the catastrophe of climate change or biodiversity loss starts to hit onto our doorstep. So that had been like, the kind of story behind like why it all started.
Thank you so much. That was, I think, really helpful in terms of understanding the larger context of what's GroundUp's positionality in this broad, huge conservation space. That's not just limited to this country of India, but even beyond that, I think these stories are very similar to what we are hearing across the world. So thank you so much for setting that context up for all our listeners today. I think let's go a little bit more personal, maybe, in the next question. Both of you come from very unique personal journeys and have had very different life experiences. So maybe starting with you, Radhika, maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about how your life experiences have shaped the way you look at conservation today.
Right. So I actually come from the capital of Maharashtra, which is Mumbai, which is a very big city. And my life journey was in advertising. For me, nature was something that I loved, something that I wanted to do, something I was feeling very strongly connected with. So I just went off to this Himalayan state in the eastern part of the country called Sikkim to work as a volunteer with a very small grassroots organization there. And my learning of conservation happened with people on the ground, with communities on the ground. I didn't know how conservation as a world worked. I didn't know the science or the biological aspects of how that was. For me, it was the love for nature. And as I started communicating with the local communities and the grassroots organizations, that's where I thought that was the game changer in my mind. I realized that they had so much more to offer. There was so much more to learn from them. And also, while there was money coming in, somehow it was just not coming in the right hands of these organizations who knew things on the ground, who knew the in and outs of the community, who also understood how, conservation needs to be pitched to these communities on the ground. And somehow the communities knew what the problem was and what the solution was. But somehow, because they were linked to the larger markets, somehow because they had started being exposed to so many other things, they felt that yes, they can perhaps put their resource at stake, while also completely understanding that if they put the resource at stake, in the long term, it's going to fire back at them itself. So I think for personally, I had been working with a lot of grassroots organizations in Sikkim, in Ladakh, and then back in Sikkim. And I realized that there was a huge potential for them to ensure that if we were to just juxtapose them to say that these people are not just frontline workers, this is where the real strength is and this is where the real intelligence is. We just need to keep tapping on them and their capacities, ensure that they have all the resources and they have the right equipped with the right skills to take this forward. And when I started working with national organizations, I kept going back to work with grassroots organizations because it just felt very warped as to, the kind of money that the national organizations were holding and the kind of money that the grassroots organizations were holding. So for me, it was always like, you work with the communities, you work with grassroots organizations, and that's when you get the work done. But at some point, you also start asking the question that, is this really going to pay you? Is this really going to be volunteer work for the rest of your life? But it so happened that I was in the middle of, working with the national organization and also doing a consultancy with a very small local organization in Ladakh. And Swapnil, I had known him over the years working in the similar landscape. And he told me about, his larger vision of how he was looking at positioning grassroots organizations. And I knew he came from a very different background than mine. He was always in the high level stuff, and I was always in the very ground level stuff. Somehow it just, somehow we had an understanding of what those shared challenges are. We knew where the potential was, and also we knew that if we are able to actually bring those resources down to the ground, it will change things for sure on the ground and the kind of crisis that we're going with. So the first time Swapnil pitched this whole idea of ground up, it just felt very correct. It also, it was a very concrete vision of something that I was doing, but at a very small level. So it just made more sense to join him on this mission and ensure that, we are actually able to redesign the way we function in conservation, and also realize that, there is like a plethora of potential that is lying out there untapped. If we are able to bring that message to the world to say that, look, Roundup is here, this is what we want to do. It's not always about the high level work, but it's actually about building the ground up. And that's where I joined him on this journey. And for me, so far, it's always been about, what is it that we can do on the ground? What is it that we can help the community with? What is it that we can help the grassroots organization with? And every time we've asked this question, and every time we've, worked with our partners on the ground, we've realized that we can achieve far more than what we would do sitting just in a, capital city office, like Swapnil rightly mentioned earlier. So yeah, that's where I come from, and that's how my journey with GroundUp got started.
Great. No, thank you
I
so much for explaining that. Go ahead, Swapnil. I think it would be
no,
great
I
to
think
understand how both of your journeys have been different, but you have reached the same conclusion. So that's very interesting to know.
no, I'm just remembering. I think it was in early 2021 or 2020. I was in Kathmandu, and the first presentation on GroundUp was given to Radhika. I had that made while I was having breakfast. And okay, I need to put this thing. I'm going to convey. And then she tells me, like, I have not even done a lot of work on that slide. And she tells me that it looks very structured. I say, okay, this is great.
No, I think that's great to know. So maybe Sapnil, you can go into a little bit detail about your personal journey as well, much more on the personal front than the professional front, maybe, and how that has shaped your work in conservation today, and the positionality that you bring to the work. Like Radhika mentioned, where she started. Maybe it would be great for our listeners to know how you started and have come to this point.
Actually, like, my last job before founding GroundUp was with ECMOD, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. It's an intergovernmental organization, extremely talented individuals, really important mandate that they serve. It's a knowledge-based organization that works exclusively on Hindu Kush Himalaya, all the way starting from Afghanistan to the Myanmar, like entire belt. They were the first people who put Hindu Kush Himalaya together as a common resource, and not a Himalaya belong to one country or others, but it belongs to everybody. It supports such a great volume of people downstream and upstream. During that time, that was kind of a precipice of my professional journey. Once you reach to that level, it was a diplomatic position. Usually people in the sector consider, like, those who choose to go towards international organization, having situated with such organizations is a great experience. 5 years I worked with ECMOD, and we were leading a very unique transboundary program that was convened among Tibetan Autonomous Region of China, Republic of China, Government of Nepal, Government of India in Kailash Mansarovar area. It was called Kailash Sacred Landscape Initiative. It's a transboundary conservation frontier, multi-country approach. I can go and talk about like Kailash program, but to remain like focus. During that time, what I personally felt was that my skills and my aptitude was much more people-centric, and I love speaking with people, listening to people. I enjoy, like, I gather my energy by having conversations, very simple conversations about life, what is possible, what is not possible, and not really fixated on one frame of mind. And during that time also, I saw that, like, whenever serving my job, whenever I was on the ground, I was able to make a change. Even if I was there for like 4 days, 5 days, convening a meeting between say the Indo-Tibetan Border Police Force or Police Department of Nepal, when we used to have joint border talk between the two nations. And during that time, I would see, like, you just have to facilitate the conversation. People already have a lot of experiences. People know what is right and what is not right, right? They live there, they know what is causing the poaching of animals. And people would bring that thing very ferociously on the table, right? And while also in EC mode, we were trained on negotiations, given the very sensitive position that organization actually holds. And throughout that time, then I saw that like I enjoy much more like working on the ground with people than working in the corridors of capitals with the government or like policy doctrines or engaging on those things. I also felt that like, policy, it's a very long process to influence the policy or engage with the policy. Its outcome are only successful when like a financial allocations are made by the government in terms of either a scheme or a subsidy or a kind of a special program, a special purpose vehicle or something. If that doesn't really lead, it's just a influencing. It doesn't see the light yet. And that I saw that there is like, but also to drive that kind of policy, while we draft the policies, they are really not grounded. We say such a high words, but when actually someone who is sitting in a particular landscape, like a block development officer, resident commissioner, department of police, this sustainability language, they will never understand the kind of language we put into like things. They need extremely practical, action-oriented language. I saw that, like, and when we say these words, etc., and it is not grounded, it is not reflecting the ground reality, we are not going to get the results. We'll be again going back and forth to the same thing, same notions, and then we wonder like why it is not working. Of course, it is not going to work. It has not been really like, lensed through the reality on the ground or its feasibility on the ground. And that was like a thing. And I took a break from AC mode in 2019. Just abruptly, I just decided that I wanted to quit because I think I felt saturated and I wasn't able to use the same energy. Once you reach to a particular point in an organization, organizations have their own processes, right? So you can reach up to 80% of the success, but the last 20% is extremely challenging. It commands quite a lot of sanctions from the larger management, given the nature of that thing. And I felt like, innovation was actually trifled and we were not moving fast. Also from my position, because I go to the ground, I speak with people and like how communities actually suffer. I still remember that one instant. I was in a border town in Nepal, and a person's son was picked up by a leopard from agriculture field. And in that conference call, he was crying. His son died, and it just felt very like, I was like taken aback with that. I just like felt very like, what the hell is going on? Like, how can we not be like sure like somebody lost their child to wildlife? And these problems were like, when you bring them on the front, they become part of the numbers in the report. But there was such a human story behind it, and it affected me a lot. I still remember speaking with BMS Rathore, who had been my mentor during that time, that sir, like, how do we exactly handle something like that? And I remember he like calming me down and things like that, write down and things. And then I decided that, okay, I want to take a break and see what I want to do next. So I took a break for a year. And during that time, I solo backpack through Southeast Asia and Eastern Africa. And all this time I was just traveling and meeting local people without any plans. And of course, my friends from Cambridge and all who are situated in this area, just to get a context of conservation. And during that time, I went into the border areas because that time I was very freshly minted from ECMO's vision of transboundary landscape. And that's a very dynamic thing, because two countries are working together or multiple countries are working together. Decisions that are made in the capital cities immediately reflect on the ground. So I travel around these all areas where usual tourists don't go. And in that area, I was speaking with indigenous people, local communities, and I saw that what experience I had of working in Nepal, India, Tibet, and China was exactly the same replica elsewhere also. Biodiversity and people were like, part of the same coin. We were just unnecessary getting into a dialogue, pitting them against each other, which was not really a necessary. And I saw that these are the problem across the aisle. I went to Eastern Africa, I went to Southeast Asia, covered like nearly 13 countries altogether. And the problems were all the same. So I thought like, okay, fine. If you want to really change, grassroots actor need support. How do we exactly provide them the support? What kind of support do they need? Before even coming at or arriving at the support, we first need to understand their situation. What exactly is happening? And that was quite a time to immerse myself into like feeling the pulse of landscape and their people, the challenges that were having. This was all very honest. There was no thing like, that I had taken a particular position, but my position was just like very like a water that bended with the situation on the ground, acknowledge and accepted the realities on the ground. Once you acknowledge and accept that as a basic starting assumption, I think from that point onwards, actual work starts, because you have disseminated all the negative connotations, like, the pressure cooker has already whistled. All the negative thing people have already put on the table. And from that point onward, things calm down. And then you can get into a dialogue as to, okay, fine, this is the things, this is the situation, but we are into it. How do we go forward? And from that conversations, actually solutions starts to come on the surface. So that had been the personal journey, I think.
I think I'd just like to point out, one thing very important that Swapnil said is that, when we get people together from very different levels of the sphere, we realize that the priorities are also very different. So in certain landscapes where I have worked in, I've realized that the agenda of the organization sometimes supersedes to the realities of the people on the ground itself. And that's where I think the discord happens, because it's the people on the ground who are interacting with that part of nature, or they are interacting every day with those realities. And somehow, because, funding is going to come through a certain stream, sometimes projects are pitched through a certain lens without really understanding that, this is not exactly what people need on the ground. And that discord has only been widening in conservation. And that's why, despite after so many decades and so many millions of dollars being moved around, we are still grappling with the same issues, and it's just getting worse. So this discord, if it widens, it's just, it's still going to, we'll be still talking about, the same problems 10 years from now. Maybe the intensity would have increased by then a lot. But until and unless we don't understand that we need to really re-look that conservation is not a nature problem, it is a people problem. And if you don't involve people on the ground, things are not going to function. There is never going to be a solution to this.
I think just rightly, like you pointed out, the question that I was having in my head was that the problem of pitting people against nature and thinking of them as two separate things. Do you think that is the hardest assumption that you have challenged to the work that you have done in this conservation space?
For me personally,
Yes.
yes, for sure. I think when we talk about conservation and my own personal experience, conservation, at least a decade before, was always the science. We know the science, we go to a ground, and we come with a certain level of high-handedness with that science to tell that this is something that you're not doing right. This needs to stop. This needs to stop. When we do that, we are at the very first step undermining people who have shared that landscape for over a millennia. We are undermining everyday life of someone who lives there in and out, and undermining everything that the identity of that person. Once we start doing that, we are alienating them from the process itself. Yes, of course, conservation has changed a lot. We talk more about, people being at the center of work, but still we come from like, I know it all, and this is what I think you should be doing. Even if we are a social scientist, we'll tell them that, we'll categorize them that, this is what we should be doing, this is what we should be doing, this is what we should be doing. But until and unless we don't drop all those, all those garbs and all those hats and just be there and just listen to them, we will not be able to break that barrier. We will always be outsiders who are coming and telling people what you need to do in your own home. And no one likes that. If you're an educated person going down, if someone tells you, you will obviously take it to the ego. But even it's not that people are not educated on the ground either. They are also as educated. And they are far enriched because of the experience that they have had with living in such landscapes for such a long time. And they have had families who've lived there in such landscape for a long time. So there is a lot of living experiences that we can't undermine. And like Swapnil rightly said initially, is that, if we don't listen, we don't have solutions that they can come up with. And they are very much interested in, of course, ensuring that this resource that their life is dependent on is also kind of balanced out with their economic needs as well. They are well aware of these things. But we can't keep always saying that, nahi, aapko ye karna hai, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this. But it's like, what is it that we can do with you to ensure that this is saved for the next generation as well?
Great. No, thank you for sharing that. Swapnil, do you have perspective that you would like to add on to that?
Yeah, I think the assumptions, they are also very internal, personal also. Like when you get trained in India on conservation research, as Radhika was mentioning that, or like a decade ago, conservation meant research, but wildlife biodiversity had remained mostly the state subject in global south, meaning like, that it was never a luxury for a common individuals to engage into conservation measures, right? Because it's a state subject, it's a common kind of a thing, right? It's a non-human being, so constitutionally they are protected, and state has to actually look after that part. But when I first time went to Cambridge in 2012 to do my MPhil in conservation leadership, my classmates, my colleagues, they came from very different countries, right? Like some representing Africa, some representing Southeast Asia, or Europe, or US, Canada, and other places. And during that time, what I saw is that like the kind of like a narrative which India had adopted when we started, like during late Indira Gandhiji's time, when we created our national park and tiger reserves, is that nature will take care of its own self, and that we needed to leave nature to its own things, right? Which is great. And this is what I had taken also as my own assumptions. But when I went there, I started to learn that like, you need active management. Like in Africa, to control the spread of a disease among the wild populations, they actually do the systematic culling of animals, then immunize certain set of populations. So all these kind of like population management theories, in practice, they actually manage. There is also in Canada, like ducks, I'm forgetting the name, Ducks International Limited or something. They put surplus population of ducks as an open tender to hunt, which supports the conservation. Such attempts were actually made in India also. But they never really saw, because in India, we have quite a lot of social connection with the wildlife, through our belief system, through our faith, etc. So that kind of approaches doesn't exist. But what I learned is that like, if you leave nature to its own course, it can take care of itself, but it will take 400 years, 500 years, and what is happening right now is across India, you would see the spread of invasive species, has really entered into almost all our national park and wildlife sanctuaries, open waters, agriculture fields. And that predominantly happened because we didn't really manage our landscapes. Go back like before 1970s, Ramchandra Guha speaks about it, Gadgilji speaks about it, Mahesh Rangarajan also speaks about it, that wildlife population at the beginning was actually at a very good numbers before 1970, and people were removed. So landscape needed tending, somebody had to mend that thing. Like invasive species, if they are spreading, someone has to go set a fire, control their population. In absence of that, they take over because they are very aggressive. And because our lands are like so ill-treated for such a long period of time, obviously on that land, only the invasive species or exotic species will grow because they don't have no competition. They don't require such a great solid substrate. And that actually reduces the fodder availability for even wildlife and also for the livestock. Where are these wildlife coming now? They're coming into our agriculture field or human settlements. It's kind of very obvious. And that's why for them to be able to have food and water, we need to manage these landscapes, and managing landscape is an active intervention. And that I personally feel is like one of the, and there's so much science that has advanced. If you go to Australia, if you go to Europe, how they manage their landscape for a very little biodiversity that they have. In our countries, in tropical countries, ecosystems are far more diverse, far more, because there is so much diversity. That's why there's a lot of resilience. A little bit of an effort, little bit of push shifts the ecological functions trajectory towards repair. Meaning currently they are in deflected climax and they can be brought back into on the track, where native species actually take over, meaning like more fodder for the wildlife, more food for the wildlife, so that like, this human elephant conflict or human wildlife conflict, they don't get so aggravated. A friend of mine and also a colleague called Panduran, he just recently told me this one thing that like nowadays, more livestock is inside the forest and more wildlife is outside of the forest, as in like a protected area. And that just shows, right, like where we are right now, how much like we need to break that assumption that nature can heal itself. Of course, it is a very powerful being, like, as an entire entity, as a Gaia. But it, of course, requires direction. It requires management towards a structural process, because we have really, really deteriorated the functions, and earth as a sense or a land as a sense do not have all the fuel, all the right kind of seeds, right kind of machineries to pull it back together. It can do it, but in absence of human beings, which I don't see it's happening, anytime soon. So that's why landscape management is extremely crucial. And that's also another assumption that we need to really look at need to convince to people, what exactly is. The latest narratives on nature-based solution, etc. People talk about that part, but I think our definition of nature-based solutions are very, very limited to either forests in the city or wetlands in the periphery, that because they provide anchoring of things, groundwater recharge. But I think nature as a whole is everywhere. Every square meter of land is representation of one or the other ecosystem, which means that ecological engineering should take over the technological interventions. And that's where nature-based solution comes. And each ecosystem, be it like sand dunes, mangroves, desert, or like grasslands, partial lands, rivulets, islands, they all are doing their ecological engineering job, And we need to recognize that part and utilize their own internal processes that brings the homeostasis and resilience together.
Okay, I think this has been great to understand the assumptions that you both have been tackling and seeing in the conservation space. I think what would be interesting to also understand for our listeners is why the name Ground Up. Where did that name exactly come from?
It's actually quite a funny story. While back in the idea of GroundUp actually started in 2020. We got officially incorporated in 2021, but the work had already started and commenced on the kind of synthesizing what the idea is, what we want to do, etc. in 2020. Around that time, I was already traveling quite a lot extensively in field in Nepal and in Himachal Pradesh, India. And at that time, I was based in Kathmandu. One evening, I had done kind of potential list of names that could cover the gamut of work that we are trying to do. And I was sitting with this very close friend of mine, Sajal, and she and I, we were just having coffee, and I was telling her I'm just not able to pinpoint to what should be the name. And then at that time, I was explaining her what is the work that we are doing, and she just casually said GroundUp, that this is the work. And it just quickly I said within 3-4 seconds, I realized yeah, this sounds it sums up almost everything that's happening. And that's how the actually name came into being. So all credit goes to Sajal for being there at that particular time while we were sipping our coffee, that she came up with as a reflex that this could be the name. And then it came to be the name of company.
Great. I think just like how this funny story indicates the unique positionality of GroundUp as an organization, the other unique aspect of it, which I'm sure a lot of people are always curious about, is why is GroundUp Conservation operating as a business and not a non-profit organization? Maybe if you could explain how the business model exactly works, I think that would be very great.
Yeah, I think it's a very critical question, and I often get asked about that question. I must also acknowledge that we are still a startup and we are learning as we are going every day. And the work is innovative, and that's why the convictions are there, but not all answers are there yet. With that as a starting point, I think it would be first good to explain what the model is. As I was explaining before, the problem is of grassroots organization, and they need to be empowered so that they are able to take sustainable long-term program to repair the ecologies. And to do so, they require funds. But obviously, the non-profit sector works from project to project. Even if there is commitment for 10 years, it is still a project. So how do we ensure sustainability, right? Sustainability, it's not only in terms of the project intervention, but most important point is the finance. Currently, most organization assumes that government will take over. After the project is there, we will submit them the policy brief, or we will show them this thing. We'll also commit our resources to be there when the actual scale of phase starts to come into play. But that alone will not really substantially support the financial things. It's a very long drawn process to even ensure the financial influence or financial commitment from the government. But if you look at that, each of the ecosystems, especially in a tropical belt, are extremely productive. Every land produces through the photosynthetic means, plant produces some kind of food. And almost every other thing is part of the provisional services. Provisional services are hardcore goods that the nature actually provides, which has a marketable traction, meaning that somebody is there to pay for that kind of thing. The aesthetic, the cultural, regulatory services are all slightly different things, but almost like a fodder or timber or fiber or medicine aromatic plants, they all have already been part of the market economy. And if we are to use the productive capacity of this landscape, will require a sustained level of financing. So what if we can actually utilize that sustainability aspect or like self-producing power of landscape and ecosystems to our advantage, wherein that we are able to finance the long-term conservation aspect, right? To do that part, we will have to use the business as a case. If we want to really become self-independent, that this conservation measure should find their own money. And to do that thing, then one of our most essential offering is conservation enterprise. Conservation enterprise is a for-profit spin-off for a grassroots organization. And very simply to put, at the beginning, if we were suggesting that like conservation should finance its own, should be able to finance itself, then we needed to learn business. And if I have to learn business and suggest other people to undertake business, I needed to learn business. What exactly are those assumptions, right? And having training in government, having training in research organization, or some of the implementing agencies or non-profit sector at large or development sector at large, business thinking, business mindset is usually not inculcated. We have a luxury of time because the resources and money is funded by one or the other channels. And there's no kind of a notion on return on investment, at least not so much in the non-profit as it is so nuanced, so clear in a private sector. So my very close colleague and a very close friend, Rajan Bajacharya, he gave me the foundation of understanding business and why business actually matters. Secondly, businesses are essential because so far many organizations are working on pilot to generate the evidences. And then we take that evidences and submit it to the actors. In our South Asian case, it is the government. But of course, that evidence to move into like a scale requires business apparatus, business thinking, to be able to go through that thing, like that where will be the equal level of finances, or what is the finances that will come beyond the sustainable finance at the beginning as a seed funding or as like an incentive by the government. Government cannot keep on pumping money, right? They do that thing for protecting our wildlife sanctuaries and national park. And you would see India spends like millions and millions of dollars on looking after just like 4% of approximate area, which are protected areas, without really real financial remuneration. So that, of course, is not like a sustainable model. At that time, like startup and kind of that phase had just been launched, but very few people were working and operating in the biodiversity space as a for-profit spin-off, which is still the case largely. So these were things. And when we incorporated GroundUp as for-profit, it was just to address some of the bottlenecks of non-profit sector, which are scale, long-term sustainability, finance mobilization, beyond the donor or a grant or a development aid. That how can we actually generate the finances. And also now, ever since we have been incorporated to current context, what I have seen and observed and experienced is that there are quite a lot of supporting environment if you are running a business. For example, banking sector provides you overdraft or provides you loan, or there's a single window operating mechanism that Government of India has actually allowed for considerable amount of ventures, as long as you are generating profit, and secondly, you are generating employment. Both of those things are possible. And if you are able to think through the business lens, and if biodiversity and climate change are the risks that everybody is facing, and if there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. If that opportunity exists, there's of course paying clients who would see that their operations or their productions or their companies are at exposure, and they need ecological solutions to solve some of these challenges that their companies or production lines or supply chains are actually hamper. And if that opportunity exists, then why should biodiversity conservation not be looked at business? And why should it always be labeled as feel good factor? I think it is personally everybody's responsibility to look after non-human beings for the sheer services that the nature has been providing us. And because we have taken them for granted for so long and not been able to assign the monetary value, that's why we are not able to understand the repercussions of this polycrisis. And that is also the reason as to why we thought that business would be a better way, simply because we want to go to scale and bring in more and more accelerated pathways to replicate the kind of successes that we are gaining. And as I mentioned, because the business model is very simple, 3 services offerings are there in GroundUp. They are addressing to all the challenges that I had enlisted at the beginning. First is grassroots organization development. Second is landscape management, plan design and implementation support to the grassroots organization or towards that partnership that we forge at landscape level. And third one is the conservation enterprises, these 3 service models. And what we do is we design this long-term program along with participation of local communities, grassroots organization, and attract kind of a blended finance, which means that like some budget comes from the government schemes, some budget comes from the seed funding, either through the donor or grant cycle, and some comes also from the contribution of local people because they see like, investment portfolio and there are potential opportunities for either their own family members to get a job or like, to repair some of the ecologies or address to that, like some of the problems that they are seeing. So, and because it is like kind of a business offering, we are able to structure our solutions, streamline them, and be extremely surgical in terms of the solution that we are providing. Because if it is a paying client and if they are giving you money which is not grant, they will want exactly that the problem is solved, right? So you have to innovate yourself to a great merit, and non-profit sector doesn't allow you to question to such a depth, that it becomes so much relevant to the person who is paying. In most of the cases in our development aid sector, we know that the donors are sitting somewhere else, and the level of accountability that we have is how we are spending the money, that it is following the fiduciary responsibilities. But also at the end, we are like synthesizing the impact numbers or developing the narrative reports, but or like changing the policies, but like really seeing it through at the long term requires a business mindset. And that's why like GroundUp as a thing, we decided that we wanted to venture into a for-profit enterprise. And also what helps is that like the profit that we are generating, we have ability to invest that profit into the conservation enterprises, which we are setting up. Like Pangi tourism is one such example. Like, within Pangi itself, like we are also working on value addition and developing handloom handicraft products under the Pangi brand, and where we are able to utilize loan as an instrument from the bank to scale up our operation, right? That kind of funding is very difficult to come by from the development sector people, that kind of like apparatus where you are thinking to launch it as like a self-sustainable enterprise that goes to a larger scale. That kind of financial instruments are limited in development aid or a traditional grant circle. And that's why it allows us quite a lot of agility and flexibility to generate our corpus and be able to invest into innovations or try out, or it also allows us quite a huge risk appetite that we are able to take. So that has been like, kind of advantage of being in a business. It's fairly straightforward, streamlined. And also government looks at you through a very different lens when you are working as a for-profit enterprise, because they have given quite a lot of pathways for people like us who champion biodiversity causes to come and work on the government projects, through the formal tendering process, through like DPR generation, etc. That kind of work doesn't happen in non-profit sector, So that has opened up quite a lot of doors for us, which also means that like we have enlarged our pool of potential funding or like financing options to a very different segment that is yet to be tapped to a greater extent, beyond the traditional grant making subjects.
Got it. No, that's I think very interesting to understand how the whole financing lens that you've applied to the question of why GroundUp exists, and how financing is one of the crucial things that you look at in kind of fixing the problems that is there currently for grassroots organizations. You've also taken a very similar lens to how GroundUp itself is financed. So I think that's great in terms of using that innovative lens on both ends for our listeners to also understand. I think now that we have a lot of context about the journey of both you and Radhika of GroundUp Conservation, I think it would be good to move a little bit towards talking about the philosophy and approach of how we actually do these things on the ground and the experiences that we've had, not just between the two of you, but also the larger team that you have at GroundUp. So maybe we can start by talking about something that we hear all the time. Restoration is something that is often thought to be on the same lens as planting trees. So can you share a particular example of, or any story, where essentially we have heard you say this a lot of times, that restoration actually begins with trust and not with trees. So if there is any story that kind of exemplifies how this notion can be applied on the ground and what it means on the ground, maybe you can share something around that.
Yeah, I think like, generally like restoration is like, really, it's a very vast topic, very vast subject, and quite a lot of disciplinarity comes into play. And so far, like, people who use restoration immediately to convince the people who are sponsoring that kind of venture comes into, it's like, diluted to just basic planting trees. But that's not really the case. Ecology needs to get repaired. Even if you consider like forest needs to be restored, trees are not just the only thing, right? There are shrubs, there are herbs, there are insects. It's a flora, fauna, the entire organizations within that standing mass, how they work together in tandem with each other, how each one actually fulfills a particular niche where they are operating and trying to fix the entropy into the larger thing so that the system as a whole stabilizes itself. Having just like, series of plants might not yield that kind of results. And to do so, you would require trust of people for a very simple fact that we as a practitioner or as a scientist cannot claim to know the history of that landscape. What was that history 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? 100 years is just 3 generations for Earth. That is just like a blink of a eye. And that kind of like, knowledge actually comes from people. And people will share that kind of knowledge only if they trust you. If there had been instances from my own mentor, late Sri Prakash Gole, who was the founder of Ecological Society. They worked on like, grassland restoration, wetland restoration in Maharashtra. And like, people started benefiting from it. But just because of like, certain vested interests or political instability, all those restoration efforts were actually curtailed. People actually throw stones and destroyed all those landscape that was being worked around. So like, people's ownership and trust is prerequisite. Nature bounces back itself. If you are able to manage people, 50% of restoration work is done. And how will you manage people is only if there's a trust in what you are offering. And trust is actually gained only if you really put all your expectations, all your interests very in an honest way, in a transparent way on a table. People are very smart on the ground. They live there on everyday basis. We cannot really consider them that they don't understand science or things like that. One of our very close friends from KTK Bell, they have this kind of like, something very beautiful. They say that farmers are professors, meaning that like they understand, they toil the soil every day, right? They understand the relationship between the plants and things like that. And to cite an example, we are no longer working in Nepal on that project. We exited from there. But like that example is one that I could cite, how the trust is actually very critical. We were working there on restoration of wetland. And the purpose was to bring back the avian diversity and density. Meaning, in the historical past, Kushitapu Wildlife Reserve is actually in Nepal's first Ramsar site, which is like, wetland of very important significance because it's a home and resting place or refuge to loads and loads of migratory birds. But over the period of time, because nobody managed those wetlands, invasive species have taken over. Like 90% of the wetlands in periphery of those things is infested with the water hyacinth, which is an exotic species and invasive species, and taifa, which is a resident species but very aggressive. So it's an indigenous species but still aggressive things. And just having an indigenous species also doesn't help. You need wetland to produce a lot of food. Food comes from primary producers, which are grasses. That's like most essential carbohydrate that the plant produce, and carbohydrates are required for, it's a easy combustible fuel. So when the birds are migrating, they need to take thousands and thousands of miles of fly path, right? And they need easy combustible fuel. So if more carbohydrate is there, instead of taifa or water hyacinth, and carbohydrates are produced by the plants, and the plants needs to be managed, they need to grow. So you need to eradicate these invasive species and also eradicate taifa that has overgrown and create an area for native grasses to come over so that they produce the seeds, right? All that knowledge that I'm able to share right now came from the local people. They were able to tell me that thing only because I was telling them this is a problem that I want to solve. How can I solve that thing? And they saw that this guy is like very passionate about birds, and birds were our identity. Ramsar site was declared, and Koshitapu was first Ramsar site in entire Nepal, 1986. And so they also had a lot of like, kind of a social bonding and a personal connect with that status of the place, right? And so it's quickly turned into like, how we can be frugal and how we can actually bring back this diversity and density of birds. And they started to provide all the solutions by being extremely frugal. Like we had hardly any money, that was like a 8-hectare land parcel that we were managing as a wetland. And we spent like really just like 12 lakh Nepali rupees, which would be just like, maybe 12 to 13,000 US to repair that thing. And in a first instance itself, like, when the local people took over and they clear the taifa and water hyacinth, immediately the bird diversity had bounced back like quite exponentially because we created the space for them. Like, what it indicates is that earlier, before starting the work, we had recorded the baseline data for like 2 seasons where there were only 25 birds that we had enlisted with like proper methodological baseline generation. And after the intervention, that number shot to 180 birds, and that's quite an incredible. What it shows is that nature is all over around us. Birds and wildlife is all around us. They're just waiting for getting a space, or our life is just waiting for a chance. If we give that thing, they bounce back. That they are able to bounce back only because people were supporting. Which again, I say, like, restoration is 50% is job is managing people. If you are managed to broker that relationship, build the partnership based on trust, transparency, and also risks, like, that this might not even work, but like action is essential, that should decide the further course of action. So even if like, 10-year, 20-year long vision can be broken down into chunks of like 3 year, we do this work, iterate, understand what went, what didn't go as per the plan, and keep on that continuous inquiry on the table, you start to see like how ownership actually starts to dictate the next steps on what is happening. So yeah, that is what is the thing. Like, so that to repair that kind of a thing, just simply planting the trees will not be adequate. And you can plant the trees in the areas, but if there is a desert or if there are grassland, if you end up like, planting the trees, it will replace what used to be there.
Yeah.
That supported the livelihood, supported like, great level of indigenous population of like pastoralists, the livestock breeds. Majority of our best breeds come from this desertic or like savanna kind of a habitat or a grassland kind of habitat from central India to the western India, or even from like the base breeds of sheep, yak. They all come from pastoral lands of the mighty Himalayas. So that's why, like, these things are extremely essential, that like it's just not planting trees, it's oversimplification of the idea, but we need to fix and repair the ecologies. In absence of that, like, it will give the benefit, of course, who doesn't like having plants near to them, but then we might not be able to get the anticipated results. But if your objective is just to plant the trees because you love trees, it's okay. But you cannot really go to the massive scale that is required to really push back this polycrisis and buy some more time.
Right. I think, Radhika, so Swapnil mentioned this really interesting point about how the indigenous knowledge that was shared with him from the communities that were present in that area really helped him actually be able to reach that understanding of how do we really get the bird population of that particular area to bounce back. From that's a very interesting idea of someone going from like a very scientifically trained background going into a community where everyone will talk from a very different practical experiential lessons that they have had, and combining both of them can be quite complex at times. So from your experience, how do you exactly balance knowledge of communities of indigenous people, which is very much something that has been passed down generations in their families, in their communities, with especially regenerative science and modern tools that are mostly scientists trained in these days?
Sorry, I think it's a very rich blend. I mean, if you just understand two as very distinct subjects, you know that the science is obviously required on the ground. And then you also know that, people's lived experiences counts because they have seen the trajectory of change. They have had a different relationship in terms of usage of those resources as well. Yes, sometimes on the ground, when the science is infused, it can probably help better everything that they have been doing. But if we don't blend these two worlds, and if we don't kind of, bring a convergence of these two worlds, then things are not going to happen rapidly as much as that we do. And to balance it out, the crisis and all of that as well, both are required. You cannot say one is not required, the other is not required. And I also feel that, the indigenous knowledge that is there, of course, a lot of it is not documented. Sometimes
I think we lost Radhika there. We can just wait for 2 minutes till she fixes the internet.
Sorry, I think I lost my internet there.
Yeah, no worries. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was trying to say is that, so like in one of our project sites, Pangi, We do know that there is unseasonal harvesting happening of so many of the species there. And people understand that, yeah, this is not something that used to happen before. And people also understand that, this is exactly how we need to do. But now we have the science to back it up and tell them that, look, every time you're doing this, you are ruining the system one step at a time, even more. And this is actually going to lead to an extinction. And you're not going to have any other livelihood from this in the next 2-3 years. If you're able to make that science understand into their economics, they are also willing to say that, yes, okay, we understand that. And yes, what we have been doing traditionally is as important as our economic needs, right? So ultimately, these two worlds need to blend in a very they need to kind of influence each other, and they need to really blend in a way that both parties understand that both are equally important to each other, and it's not that the one has more weightage than the other. Ultimately, I feel, like I said initially also, conservation is it's a people problem. And if people are not part of that solution making, then conservation on the ground is not going to happen the way it needs to happen.
I also wanted to add into that part that, like, see what is also happening, that traditional knowledge in itself also is eroding. One of my friend Rajiv, who is the founder of KTK, I heard him once say that we are losing traditional knowledge far more faster than the species loss. And what it means is that, like, even if you go into the remote fringes of the landscapes, where there are like indigenous population, local communities, need not necessary that like that kind of knowledge still is retained to its pure form. Because the traditional local communities have also moved on, they have become part of the mainstream. And there are, of course, like some places anecdotal information, some places old people are still there in the living conditions and they're able to guide. But a larger population also do not have the same sense of traditional knowledge or practices as it used to be like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So in that case, science is something that we need to fall back upon, because practices not necessarily only from India, but adjoining countries also. Some or the other places, people have written about it and have documented that part. And we need to then go back when like there is no like a traditional knowledge repository that you can access. Or if those kind of provisions are not available, you need to fall back upon science. Even in case of there is a traditional knowledge exists, the forces of development, the forces of climate change, the loss of species is something that even the community had not seen in recent times. Like the way rainfalls are coming, the landslides that are happening in our own things. I have seen like, or the snows that have melted considerably, that the glaciers have retreated. Even the local people, like old people, when we go to meet like someone who is 70, 80 years old, they themselves see and they are shocked that this is not something that we had seen in the past, And in such cases, the blend of scientific knowledge or scientific tools that are available must find and get merged with the traditional knowledge. Where actually traditional knowledge plays the most significant role, in my opinion, is when we have to deploy the solution. They're extremely frugal. They will use the same, like, you can create your ballpark estimates about how the intervention will look like. You say that it is going to require, say, 100 rupees. But when you go on sanctioning, getting that money sanctioned, etc., it will come down to like say 70 rupees or something. And in that limited amount of money, how can we be frugal and still get the same results, right? That kind of like practicality, pragmatism is actually provided by local people, because they know they have the local tools, local means. Sometimes they use the bark of the tree, or sometimes like in case of like, this wetland that we were working on, we needed to create, to manage the wetland, you need to manage the hydrology, meaning the waters. You need to flood the wetland. You need to also give a drought regime to the wetland. And to do that, we needed to pour some cement and create levees to pull the lever up and down. We didn't have money. At that time, these people came and they said, sir, we will just buy the bags which are like used for the urea and phosphate, those things, and we'll put the sand into it, the sand from the riverbed itself. And we'll create that sand, like mounting these bags on one or the other. And whenever we want to flood the wetland, we will put the sand as like kind of a shield, as a wall. And when we want to get the water read and like allow the wetland to drain water, that time we'll just pick up 10, 15 bags and again mount it thing. The cost of putting that cemented structure together was cost somewhere around 5 lakh rupees. And this work was done in just like buying the gunny bags and local people who put the sand and like put that thing together. And that costed us less than like what, 5 to 6,000 rupees. So imagine like kind of a frugality that they bring, right? And it matters even more because conservation does not have luxury of lot of finances as you will have for construction of roads or like flyover or station or like health institute or things like that. So we need to be very resource optimistic, very use that thing very judiciously, and that's where the role is extremely significant of local people.
Great. No, I think that's very interesting that a lot of the frugality that we talk about, a lot of it goes back again to numbers. And one thing that you were referring to earlier was that the ROI, that's usually something that is very prominent, plays a huge role in how businesses allocate finance towards what they really want to allocate resource finance towards. That might not always be the case in the nonprofit sector. And a lot of it comes down to when we look at ROI or just generally how we are creating impact and where we want to allocate resource, it comes back to numbers. So many organizations only measure success in terms of numbers. What does success look like for GroundUp specifically?
Actually, I remember a quote from a friend, Chris. He had written that quote into his signature. And it said that it's very difficult, it's very easy to lie with statistic, but it's very difficult to prove something without statistic. And that's why the number plays a lot of significant role. But number alone is not enough. A lot of problem that we are facing is because of a particular behavior traits that we adopted. As a society, as a nation, as community, as people or representative of certain region. A behavior shift is very difficult to quantify in numbers. So the numbers must also marry along with the narratives and qualitative information. Qualitative information actually tells us the shifts in the way people have started to see, observe, feel connected with certain things. And that matters a lot because behavior shift is what is going to take us towards a long-term solution or towards long-term survival of human race, not only the biodiversity. And for GroundUp, while we, of course, for a quantitative thing, because we work a lot with the numbers and because it's a business, we have to acquire the data in quantitative way. Like in terms of the number of hectares, number of species that are there, how many of them are IUCN category, threatened species or things, what is the population that is bouncing back, or in terms of the livelihood, how the women are gaining income as a means, as an added income, etc. Those kind of information we gather for our quantitative information and also to get a sense of return, etc., etc. But in terms of the qualitative things, what really matters is that we position biodiversity as one of the stakeholders into all the discussion that we have. That when we say that biodiversity is a stakeholder, meaning that when we say that stakeholder engagement, the financial allocations are actually governed, right, for addressing these particular stakeholder. When you give biodiversity as one of the stakeholder label, which means that it must receive some level of investment. So for us, what matters is that before intervention, before we enter into the landscape and after we enter into the landscape, how biodiversity was actually perceived by people. How did that change? How did biodiversity started to become not just as one of the partial or peripheral beneficiary, but actually one of the central stakeholder into the discussions. And that change when you see where in usual trends of development or finances, biodiversity was not even considered as a part and parcel of the dialogue. It was just limited to list of species or trees that we planted. But we actually having engaged with this kind of people, biodiversity gaining a central traction. That's the success that we actually measure ourselves with. The biodiversity become a stakeholder. There are quantifiable, tangible investment, but also returns that are recorded along that biodiversity. And also the narrative shifts. You start to see how politicians or how the panchayat leaders, how local communities start using the word non-human beings in their own ways, or biodiversity in their own ways. Like in Pangi, we say, I heard people saying कि वो तो भगवान की संतान है और वो वाइल्ड लाइफ जो थी वो हमारे से भी पहले से यहाँ पे है, तो वो लोग तो ओरिजिनल एंसेस्टर्स है इस जगह के. So that kind of notion when you start to see being experienced among the people, that gives a sense of that you have been able to elevate the stance or significance of biodiversity. These are some of the examples. Also for the non-English speakers, the non-Hindi speakers, or also people who don't understand Hindi, I just wanted to translate that quote. In Pangi, people said that the non-human beings, wildlife, are santan, or offsprings of God, and they must be protected because they were in that landscape even before human arrived. So they are the true indigenous beings of that landscape, and how they assign that kind of notion to non-human beings is also extremely important and significant.
No, I think that's a very interesting take on how success is very multidimensional and very much depends from one landscape to another, one community to another. So I think keeping that depth in mind, like Swapnil, you had shared that story with us about how about the person in Nepal who lost their child to an animal attack, and how that changed a lot of the way that you looked at conservation. And similarly, the other examples of, all across your career that you've seen. Radhika, similarly for you, has there been some story from the field which has stayed with you, a moment that really changed the way that you think about your work?
Yeah, I think it has to be a similar interaction with the community. I was working in this very remote area of Sikkim, and there we were. I had just started learning about conservation, and we would talk about forest conservation in a way that was like, we need to do this, we need to save this species, we need to ensure that, this entire, the virginity of the forest is not lost, were the extractive measures that the community had started getting in. And I remember this lady coming up to me and telling me that, we live here every day. I know this forest far longer than I have known conservation people coming here and telling us what to do. And she also told me that, if I don't take this firewood from this forest as and when I need, I don't have gas cylinders here. I don't know how I will cook my food. I don't know how I will stay warm in winter as well. These were very basic things that I had not seen as to how they were looking at the forest. And it really made me think that, okay, I don't think as someone coming from outside, we really are able to relate the everyday interaction people have with their surroundings. And to me, this was something so basic that she needs to cook food at the end of the day. She needs to just keep herself warm in the winter. And why am I here telling her that, don't go to the forest, don't cut this, don't cut that? Well, I'll be going back home at the comfort of my home and having food and having maybe a heater in my place to ensure that I'm keeping warm. I think this was at that time, it just hit me very hard. And it hit me in a way that, who am I to tell them what they need to do? Who am I to tell them that, we should be doing this, we should be doing this, we should not be doing this? And I think it's not always about, what the people think, how we are coming with our own prejudices, but it's also our own prejudices that we are coming to the field with. And I also feel that over the years, the kind of interactions that I've had with community and just being able to understand from their perspective and their daily interactions with that landscape, you always start questioning that, are you there doing the right thing, or are you there just obligating a project that you've been a part of? This is a question that I have always felt very necessary. And I also feel sometimes when I've worked in conservation that, the fundraising is so important. When I talk about project and all of that, that fundraising is so important that I am willing to say that yes, this problem exists in the landscape, though that problem must have evolved over a period of, the last few years. But I'm still sticking to the same narrative of the problem because I know that's going to fetch me funds. I feel that honesty as conservationists and as people who are trying to work with the communities, it is our prerogative how we want to make that priorities shift. If we are not able to align our priorities with actually what is required, that it's not the conservation of the species anymore, but there is a larger issue of, say, water scarcity in this landscape. And that needs to be addressed more than trying to raise money for a species which is very extremely charismatic in the region. I think those everyday interactions, those everyday dealings that people have, that is something that we need to really understand and layer our conservation understanding and fundraising understanding to that. If we keep saying that this is a blanket problem and this is the blanket solution, we'll only be raising money and we will be only doing some ad hoc things on the ground, but it's not really going to change the way we want to change things on the ground.
Got it. No, thank you so much for sharing that anecdote. I think it brings a lot of thought to how we have been thinking about this, to our entire discussion around how we have been separating biodiversity conservation from people. And there is always a huge focus on protecting and saving and taking into consideration a certain angle of it, but we keep missing one piece or the other usually when we go into these solutions. So finding a holistic lens of looking at all sides of the problem together seems to be something very complex, but something that I think a lot of us are working towards collectively. So hopefully there is progress towards that as well. Okay, so I'll move to the next question. I think one of the things that, Swapnil, that maybe we can talk about is we've talked a lot about where we are right now, but the fact that a lot of this has been centered around loss that we have seen. So conservation deals with loss in many different ways. It can be of, species, of forest, even in terms of trust, like we have just talked about, right? So how do you personally carry and process this sense of loss that is perpetually there in conservation work?
I think, it is processing that kind of a loss or like failure or a mistake. It's like a very personal thing, like how one processes it. I personally are like, governed by the wisdom that I have gained over the past years of having traveled, learned, and also been mentored by quite a lot of people. And I see that, like, you can name examples, like, as I was mentioning previously, Professor Gore's work on wetland restoration that was thrown away by people because of the vested interests. So all the species that were like brought back, they again, like, left the landscape. And um, or even if, like, recently I was in Papua New Guinea and there's a guy called Jim. He and his wife has been working with indigenous people there for past like 15, 20 years. At one point of time, he and his wife and their children, they shifted into the indigenous territory. And at one point, they were actually labeled for some misdoing, which was all like fabrication, but they were beaten up. Their house was burnt, and like, all sorts of experiences that they say. There's a very nice documentary on his and their journey, and they still continue to work with the same people, right? So given that, like, it's a cyclical process, it's a long-term commitment, these sort of ups and downs are part and parcel, and we need to accept that and move forward. I think most important part is to arrive at a particular goal or the target that you set in. So it can deflect, it can deviate, it can change its path, it can also give loads of setback. But if you are fixated towards, like, that long-term vision, this internal deviation that happens become part of your lessons on how you can, like, go forward next time. And but also at the same time, I'll tell you that, like, even though there's a loss, but if you work in restoration, if you are working on the land or water, you see that how quickly the biodiversity comes back also. When you start to see, like, the pioneer species such as reptiles or insects, they start to come, like butterflies or, like, certain species of snake or like birds that you were not really anticipating, but they showed up, as a response to your intervention. That also gives you quite a lot of something to hold on to, because you have seen nature coming back and like how she reacts, when you give the chance. But what I want to say is that, like, effort tend to fail, but then the ways are not failure, right? You brought that thing back and you showed that as an example, which means that if it didn't work here, it might work somewhere else. As I was saying, that ground is empty. Like, we have got some 78 thousands of wetlands across the country, freshwater wetlands only. And so much work is to be done. So if it didn't work here, I'm sure there is some better combination of people who pursue these benefits or are really, really suffering through not having maintained their ecologies, and potentially they might like show us the path, give us a chance to exercise some of our skills. And that is the part and parcel I think we just need to take. And anybody who, like, if you speak with any kind of like organizations founder, like we have so many in India, great institutions of this country, they will also say you the same thing, that we cannot allow emotions to take over the logical sequence of as to why we are doing what we are doing. We cannot really forget what the fight is all about or what it is for. If you forget that thing, then, like, of course the fear will overtake that it is a failure and we might not be able to bounce back. And we are fortunate that, like, some of the colleagues that we have at GroundUp, they carry that kind of wisdom, but also experiences in their own merit that allows them to see a little bit of a hope, a different hope in the way we operate. The periods are long, the commitments are long, which means because it's a new innovative approach, it requires different kind of commitment. And thankfully, we have been so far very fortunate to have such a team members in our entire operations, but also the support from the grassroots organization who allow for this kind of even if there's a failure or things didn't work out the way we wanted to, they are the one who come forward and kind of console us that this is part and parcel. We did this one, we can do even better next time, or we can change our route and try doing things in a different way. There are always bad and good people. There are always bad and good lessons. We have to learn from the failures and repackage, repurpose ourselves, refine ourselves during the next time.
Got it. I think one interesting thing that I do want to touch upon in everything that you said is that though trust is broken, not just with communities, but even with nature, there is so much effort of rebuilding that aspect back. And like you said, that when there are failures, a lot of time communities come back and say that, there's still something that happened and they still would like to be on that track. What is, for you, what is that element that kind of is essential to rebuilding that kind of a relationship, whether it's with the community or whether it's with the landscape? What is necessary for that rebuilding to actually happen?
I think, we need to accept the situation of failure or trust being broken was a reason by a human error or human mindset. Somebody must be troubled or we ourselves might be troubled that we didn't see this thing properly, that expectation was set out and expectations were not met. There was a miscommunication that happened, or there was a lack of communication that happened that led to this path. After you have got through this entire chaos or failure or a setback, there comes a time when the dust starts to settle on the ground and clarity starts to emerge as to where things went wrong. During that process, we must acknowledge and accept that ultimately everybody is human. And if we are human, we are bound to make mistakes. If you leave the, how you exit matters a lot. It's relationship, whether the family front or with your, peers or anybody, right? We need to keep a door open for a dialogue to resume. We cannot allow extreme toxicity or poisonous things, even in the worst of our emotional state, to allow that thing to supersede the good. So whenever that thing has happened, naturally, you need to take a pause for a while. Don't force or don't try to repair the situation. Allow for it to settle down a little bit. Find out what happened, where you went wrong, where you could have done it better. Allow and believe in the thing that if you had done things in a good intention with the community and they also had the same good intentions, I think the work finds its own path to again start and resume. But it also need not necessarily that be the case. So you start somewhere else. Whatever kind of a path that you had shown, maybe it's not you. It will come into a different shape and form with similar energy by somebody else who will take it up and then carry forward that work. Legacies are left by the founders or by earlier people and are picked up by somebody else, maybe in a very different transformation or a slightly changed ways. But if biodiversity remains a goal, science tells us or the experience tells us these are the ways. So if these ways are explained and are there out with the people who had worked on it, maybe somebody else will take that work forward, need not necessarily that we have to champion that cause for all the time. And I was explaining about Jim's story. I think these kind of stories are there where people committed their life to one landscape, one group. And in that kind of thing, there were a lot of fallouts. And especially if your skin is in the game, these are part and parcel of the situations because there are just so many diverse voices, so many diverse aspirations, interests, fears, insecurities that are going to come on the surface and push us to get that thing. But having a little bit of a mentorship, wisdom, but also some experience years who can guide you through such a turmoil, difficult time helps a lot. And that's why we need to have a larger safety net around us. And that safety net is provided by people who believe in the cause or the position that we take or the approach that we take. And thankfully, we have got those. So we fall back upon those people, and some of them are ground people also, not necessarily from cities, but they are the indigenous people or they are the grassroots leaders who showcases their examples that what worse situation they were in compared to what is our situation. And then you see that, okay, fine, as bad as it seems.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great takeaway for the next question that we'll move to. For all our listeners, one thing that I think that from Swapnil, what Swapnil said that we should keep in mind is the fact that everyone needs to reimagine their place in this conservation system. There's so many actors that are continuously working here, and it's important to continuously think about whether we are continuously the right people to be driving what we intended to. So we might start at the right spot, but there will always be points where we need to course correct. And that course correction might also be stepping back from it. And this is a larger conversation that we've been having in this space as well, just broadly about the role that smaller organizations, root organizations, international organizations, everyone plays, because everyone is trying to drive the same efforts. So a lot of time there is a lot of overlap. I think keeping these thoughts in mind, Radhika, maybe you would like to take the next question about how, if you can share an example of how, working with so many different partners, whether it's a corporate, whether it's the government or a larger NGO, how that has helped in scaling impact in ways that is just not possible to maybe do it alone otherwise.
Yeah, see, I think when you're working, with a grassroots organization, you have to be very realistic about how much you can reach with the kind of resources that you have. It's very important to be open to work with the government, because the government has that kind of, the vehicle and has that kind of resources to actually do the work that you're doing and scale it in a level that an organization will never be able to do. Even if you, get X amount of money to do something in the landscape, the government machinery is as such that it allows you more space, wider reach, and even far more resources. So I remember working with a small organization in Ladakh, and then we realized at one point as that, if out of 100 we are able to just reach 20 villages with the help of the government, if we are able to train the government with everything that we are trying to do, we are going to be actually be able to reach to those 100 villages as well. And that's where the collaboration comes in. And that's where we have to say that we can't say that we're going to shut our door to this, we're going to shut our door to business, we are going to shut our door to this. I don't think, just given the dynamism of so many players, so many of us wanting to intentionally do the right thing, then it has to be that, okay, who best we can partner with to ensure that this is optimized to its maximum capacity. And having said that, same thing goes with this entire thing of CSR and the corporates as well. I think the corporates, especially in India, we have the backing of, the entire CSR and how much money that is there with the CSR. I think if we are able to somehow align to say that, yes, it's not always about the number, but this is the impact that we want to see on the ground change after that 10 years. If you're willing as a corporate to give that kind of commitment to an organization to say that here we have your back. Okay, sorry, I think I lost my internet again. Yeah. So what I was trying to say is that if we can have a corporate to back an organization to say that, look, we have your back and we are here with you for the next 10 years on this journey, then I think change can happen on the ground, because as I said, Rome was not built in the day. Change does not happen over a project. It does not happen over a 2-year project or the 3-year project. It takes consistent effort on all parties, and it requires that kind of resources as well. Organizations sometimes are not able to pull those kind of resources individually, and that's why the larger ecosystem plays such an important role to ensure that they are propelled in the right direction with everything that they need. And also I feel that, when we talk about change itself, it's not unilateral. It is something that evolves as time evolves. And also we need to understand that, what was true in the first year of the project may not be true on the 8th year or the 9th year of the project. Because also the systems are moving so fast. There is an entire shift happening in terms of the economics, the social change, the political legal change that happens. And these are few levers that will keep ensuring that, you can move in a certain direction. You may not necessarily get to the destination by the end of 10 years, but at least, you have shifted a certain perspective. You have shifted the needle from where you had started. And that's why I feel it's not a one organization job or a one stakeholder job. Everyone in the system needs to come together and actually be on the same page as to how we are visioning something to change on the ground, and then move towards those things. And like you rightly said, that every stakeholder plays a very different role. There will have to be someone who implements, there will have to be someone who sponsors, and there will have to be someone who just provides the overall strategy or the technical support and all of that. If we can understand the different roles everyone plays in an ecosystem, then I think it can really function as a well-oiled machine to ensure that, change will happen on the ground as we see it or as we wish to see it.
I think as a follow-up to that question, I think when so many different actors are, working together, they're all collaborating, something that often does happen is that, they start rubbing off on each other. So a nonprofit that's working with the business will take on some of the characteristics of how the business operates in terms of the vision that it has, or in terms of some of the thinking around that long-term thinking of finance. And I feel like some of that has actually translated into the business model and the verticals that GroundUp itself has, right? So we have, like Swapnil, you mentioned earlier, grassroots development, landscape management, and conservation enterprise. So while we've talked a lot about the landscape management vertical, I think this might be a really great place to go into a bit of detail about the grassroots development and conservation enterprise bit. Is that what we see there? That is the idea that, we are strengthening the internal functions of the grassroots while also inculcating maybe some elements of what other actors in this conservation space operate as, some parts of the business the lessons that we are seeing ourselves as a startup. Is it to inculcate that in the grassroots that we partner with?
I think these three verticals, they are all interconnected with each other. And in isolation, the fundamental ultimate goal of self-financing of conservation will not be able to achieve. In the larger, if we are to distribute these three verticals in terms of their significance, I think grassroots organization development would be maybe 10 to 15 to max 20% of our job. Landscape management takes longer time because it is a work with the land and trees and nature, and it has its own timeline. It cannot really, no matter how much money you have, you cannot accelerate the plant to grow faster. I mean, you can do that in practice by just pumping in a lot of fertilizer, but that's not the way what I mean to say. Conservation enterprise is towards the self-financing. Why it matters is that, you see, NGOs are the grassroots organization that we work with. They understand these things very clearly. Their dependency is so much on the grant and so much on the donor dependence, they are not even able to retain their own leadership, let alone their staff. Project comes, project goes, or sometimes project donors' priority shift and there's a setback that all the promised fund were actually diverted to something else. That kind of shock has really curtailed their growth. Great people with a great kind of passion to really do, their hands and legs are tied and we are asking them to run and solve such a mammoth problem, which even the government has not been able to do. Last mile connectivity, these are the words that we use, but they, in real life, they are very, very huge tasks that we are not able to do. And that's why, the role of a non-government organization come into play. They are equated with the government. They are not called other non-business organization, but they are called non-government organization because they're doing the job of where the government has not been able to do it for all the reasons and legitimate reasons. So in terms of the reason as to why grassroots organization development matters is because during that process, it's not only the compliance and things like that. That kind of service providers are anyways available, like tax audit, filing of statutory requirements, fiduciary responsibilities. And I think the technology is going to overtake and simplify that job even faster, because everything will become digitization. But what matters in grassroots organization development thing is one simple part. When we do the diagnosis process, which is the first step, any landscape we enter, there we take at least 6 months just to listen to communities and grassroots organization, what the problem you are facing. So as Radhika was mentioning, some places it is a water scarcity, somewhere it is a fire, sometimes it is a landslide, sometimes it is a pest infestation, or invasive species, fish stocks are depleting, or fodder is not there. All sorts of examples, or non-timber forest produce, or medicine aromatic plants are dwindling. And these sorts of problems, when they start to surface on the thing, their repair solution requires a 10-year, 20-year long vision. And that visioning exercise, when we do with the local communities and grassroots leadership, what happens is that they get a clear-cut path onto which is the trajectory they want to do. Now, once you have got a clarity as to this is where I want to reach. So instead of being driven by the interest or the programs that are developed by the donor, they say that your programs are great. They need to get translated to this reality. This is the language that we have adopted. Please utilize this language. figure out the middle path in that place, right? So if 20-year long vision, we say that like we want to restore X sector of species, X sector of landscape in which 10 species or 20 species will get benefit, and this many number of livelihoods will be generated, this many people will gain the employment, etc., etc. That you can break down into like phases. So it provides a kind of a resilience mechanism in the hands of grassroots organization, that they know that like, these kind of setbacks will come, but this is my vision, this is where we are headed. So that clarity when you get, you would be shocked and surprised that how accelerated process gets adopted. Like we knew when we were working in Pangi, the initial thought process was to create homestays. But once the benefits were perceived, there was actually a pull factor that the local community, local administration saw, forest department saw the merit into this idea, and they accelerated that entire project. So also previously what you were asking, like, why it is not possible to work alone. But there's a lot of positive things when you work with people. You would be surprised that your notion, your ideas get adapted by other people in your absence, and they start doing that thing. We saw that in Koshitapu also, 8-hectare land parcel we worked, 50 hectare was restored by local communities without our knowledge. We didn't even know that they were doing it. We just received the photographs that they actually started the work. And they were much more frugal and much more innovative in the next attempt. In a single shot, they got it done, because they knew the process. They knew the vision. They knew, because that vision and that entire exercise came from ground up, from a consultation of everybody, their participation, their ups and downs, their problem, and everything was surfaced. So there was a commonality in understanding that this is where we need to reach. And when we say community, it need not necessarily means only the unorganized sector community. In local community, government people, staff who are residing in that local landscape, they are the local people, they are drinking the same water, eating the same rice or dal or anything. They are also part of the local communities. It's just that their role is like fixated towards something else. But they also equally are the influencer and the actor into things. So we cannot say that like governments are different and things. Local community is a consolidation of everybody who has a local stake or can influence positively, negatively to that local ecosystem or towards your cause. So these are like, sort of things. And when you think about this long-term vision, obviously then business mindset start to come in. What exactly is a business that you have your expenses met and there is something surplus and you know where you are going, that notion of surplus is extremely empowering, even into the hands of individual person or into the hands of a grassroots organization or any organization. And if that is there, then like all these sorts of shock, like how the US had pulled out all their funding, that kind of shocks are able to be absorbed by the organizations. And that's why this like business thinking needs to come into play. Have like at least to take care of our core staff, we need to have some additional revenue generating mechanisms. Some level, these kind of things are available in the non-profit sector also, because quite a lot of non-profit organizations also take like consulting gigs as a part of their job. But then if it goes beyond 20 lakh rupees, which is like somewhere around $25,000, then you have to pay taxes, which means then it becomes like as good as like a for-profit thing. You have to pay the taxes to the government. So then also have this kind of like, buffering and solutions that have largely been piloted through seed grants or through the traditional donor things. If they have to see the scale, then like, you need a business apparatus. You need a business thinking, you need a different kind of finances, you need loan, you need like, dole or like government to be able to sponsor that kind of thing. And then businesses of for-profit things are much better positioned to exercise this sort of instruments. So that kind of thinking definitely comes. And I think like larger in case of India over the past like 10, 15 years, we have started to see a lot of momentum towards like, for-profit spin-offs, even if they are like social enterprises. And the opportunities are tremendous, which means that like for organizations which has been like a legacy organization, there is also a really great opportunity to transform themselves or have their own spin-off where their own like, people who feel little bit more aptitude towards like business, towards that kind of mindset, they to be able to fill that gap because the opportunity is big, gaps are so huge. There are 380,000 registered organizations in India, approximately 1,000 protected areas. How many of them we know, who we read about, or how many wildlife sanctuary national park we can like, enlist in our own things, how many of them we have visited. So what is happening to rest of these grassroots or rest of these organizations or rest of these wildlife sanctuaries and protected area? Somebody needs to go, right, and repair and work. Nature and landscapes are waiting for somebody to come and rescue or help them to come back into the traction where they do what they do better. So that's why I feel like, this kind of like blending of these approaches would be quite good and opportune.
I think this is great because a lot of the reflections that you both have had and the lessons that you are sharing has come from the long experience that you've had in this space in very different roles in different organizations and of course in very different landscapes. What would your advice be to someone, to an organization or even to an individual who's really willing to, support conservation work from this lens, but doesn't know exactly where to begin?
Radhika,
I
you want to
think,
take it first?
yeah, I think for me, I'll probably just build from what Swapnil said in the previous question is that, I think now even traditionally NGOs were seeing that, okay, we do this project and then we start raising for funds and then again we start raising for funds. But I think now there's a clear understanding that, that is not sustainable. If you are going to lose your team every 1 or 2 years, then that's not going to really fetch you that kind of sustainability in the work that you're doing and even in the landscape and the people that you're trying to work with. I think the shift is already happening that you need to infuse some level of business acumen within the operationality of what you want to do as an organization. And I think for any organization who wants to do conservation work, they need to understand the economics of the landscape while also understanding the science and the conservation of the landscape, and also really understanding and touching into the pulse of what the community wants. Unless and until their buy-in is not there, that, this is the long-term vision, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're trying to achieve, rather, your resources, your interaction is not going to be compromised, nor your economics is going to be compromised. This is a well-rounded approach as to why we are saying that the conservation will happen while the economic also happens, and the spirituality and the sociality of your interaction will not fade. If we are able to really encompass all these different aspects, if the organization rather is able to encompass all these different aspirations from the ground as well as their own aspirations, then I think there is a chance of doing something really worthwhile within those particular landscapes as well. And I keep coming back to this whole thing of financial sustainability. I don't think, especially given the number of organizations that are out there, the vast levels of problems, the intensity of, the multitude of problems that we have, not just in the conservation sector, but even in the developmental sector. I think there's a sheer understanding that the competition for funds is also high. So unless and until you have a self-sustaining mechanism, as an organization, you're not going to be able to, take that long run as well. So if you have started to put all these different foundational aspects into the system right from the beginning, then there is a chance of, actually doing the work on the ground and sustaining it for the long term, which end of the day is what really needs to be tapped into.
Just following up with like what Radhika was mentioning, I think just like clearly what you were asking, like, organizations, those organizations which are working in conservation, I think they understand this part that like now the present context, like what approaches we used 30, 40 years ago, because of just the sheer fact that country and our continent has actually shifted towards a very different kind of a political, economic kind of a rhythm. We need to innovate. We cannot be using the same approaches, and largely conservation sector organizations have realized this part. So there's not much that we can actually suggest to conservation organization. It's just a process that we need to unlearn and allow some innovations to happen. When innovation has to happen, new people need to get an opportunity, and leadership needs to give them a chance and opportunity to exercise those parts, right? Meaning that you, instead of becoming too risk averse, allow some risk to be there. Should mistake happens, you shoulder it up and allow, like, people to allow their passion to, like, supersede than organizational reputations or organizational risks to, like, dictate what to be done and what not to be done. And this is like internally happening among quite a few organizations that I know. They are also like thinking about like now shift in the gear to remain relevant in the current context, but also to seize the opportunity, right? And in terms of like, organizations that are not working in conservation, it's a very simple and basic factor. What is conservation? Conservation and restoration and biodiversity. Any organization that is working with people who are working directly with the land or water, there is an opportunity for biodiversity conservation. As I was saying, that every square meter of land or a water is a reflection and representation of one or the other ecosystem, meaning there is a life there also. If you turn the rock, during the season, you will see some insects, you will see some reptiles or something hidden there, right? That means life is there. Even in the agriculture fields, wildlife, we are seeing leopards are coming into agriculture, or elephants coming into coffee estate. That means life is finding their ways. How do exactly you allow, while you are doing your intervention on agriculture productivity or livelihood generation, what is it that you can actually ask yourself or ask the local people, what contribution can we make to alleviate some of your own sufferings because of the wildlife or because of the biodiversity, or positively aid in the recovery of biodiversity. Need not necessary that every place we want to bring back lions or bring back elephants into that place. But even the less known taxonomic groups, birds, avian diversity, frogs, most threatened taxonomic groups are the herpetofauna, reptiles, and amphibians, because they are dependent on fresh water. Everywhere fresh water is so horrible at our country level. Almost all the rivers are polluted. They are like so much foam and things like that. So that taxonomic group can be saved in your vicinity also. And there are means to do that thing. You create artificial pond where this sort of wildlife starts to get attracted and create its own ecosystem. That's a very simple kind of thing that actually happens. So find the opportunities where you can actually ask yourself and your stakeholder what you can do for the biodiversity, and explain that, break down the biodiversity into simple words. Is there a snake? Is there frogs? Are there plants that are flowering? Or are there any birds which we used to see earlier, but they now have gone down? Go into extremely localization, contextualization of that particular place. Unbundle these like jargons. Don't use the word biodiversity. Don't use the word climate change. Unbundle that to the most simplistic form. Once you start to hear, that approach actually gives you quite a lot of pathways as to what you could do. And then allocate finances, allocate some team members to do that thing and measure what's going on. It doesn't have to be center stage of your organizational mandate. It could be peripheral, but you can still leverage and aid significantly, because restoration may 50% of job is done by the nature itself. You don't have to invest a lot of money. Once you give it a space, it just comes back on its own. You just need to pay attention a little bit. Nature is extremely powerful that way. And when you ask about individuals, those who are like city dwelling youth, who feel passionate about nature, who wants to do something but do not know what to do, I would suggest very simply, get out, travel to the length and breadth of this country. We have tremendous amount of beautiful biodiversity that has still remained here. Look at India's things largest population of tigers, last surviving population of Asiatic lions. One of the greatest population in the region of one-horned rhino. And you name it, biggest population of elephants in a country which is more than billion people. How is that even possible, right? So something must have worked and something is still there. So go travel into these areas, volunteer yourself with local organization, spend dedicate at least weekend. I'm going to spend time as a volunteer with one or the other organization who is working on either looking at the restoration or plantation of trees or working with the farmers. You will gain a lot of insights, and that will give you the also idea as to what kind of unlearning you need to do and also relearning you need to do. And then nowadays, 20 years ago, we didn't have so much access to knowledge. We used to go to even access libraries. We had to travel to Wildlife Institute of India, spend there 1 week to just read through the reports and publications. At that time, internet was not even there. But today you have access to so many things. There are YouTube courses on ornithology, simple, delivered by few of the best brains, in conservation and all. They bring such a reality into the spot. And this sort of things is something that young people can actually find their moves in supporting conservation or taking that as a career. I think climate change, everybody knows, is now gaining a lot of traction. But the next big thing is going to be towards biodiversity conservation. That is a sure shot new career trajectory where a lot of potential opportunities will come. If we have to fix such a huge empty landscape, we need a lot of ecological engineers, and that is going to be one skill that will be required. And you cannot gain that kind of skill unless until you have spent time with the nature, you understand the rhythm. So this is like a best time to enter into this domain and acquire these kind of essential skills. But also working with the nature is also very healing process. Everybody suggests that thing. We are part and parcel of the nature. Even our own generation, we see that our parents were associated with land and water. And the moment we go, we also feel very nostalgic. That emotions, the manifestation is not coming from just emotions. So there is some element that are so similar to human body and to the nature. And that's why it resonates, and that's why it's also very healing process. And everybody should use it for betterment of their own kind of mental well-being, spiritual well-being, just healing.
Yeah, I think that both a lot of insights for a lot of our listeners here today. Anyone who's looking to get started or anyone who's already in the space and has been looking for, some kind of mentorship or some kind of just advice of where to go next and how to continue thinking about all of these very complex realities that we continue to engage with when you work in this biodiversity conservation space. So thank you so much, both of you. I think we've covered a lot about what GroundUp does. We've talked a lot about your both of your journeys, the lessons and experiences that have particularly shaped GroundUp to be the way that it is in terms of its structure, in terms of its vision, and especially in terms of how it integrates science with a lot of local communities, experiential lessons and knowledge. And keeping that in mind, I think it would be good to understand the long-term vision. We might have a lot of listeners here today who might be, people that we can work with. So it might be an interesting point to touch upon of what are the next 10 years going to look like for GroundUp? What is the future exactly going to hold? And what kind of partners is GroundUp looking for? So anyone who is in our audience today, if, they fall within that category, maybe they can reach out to both of you just to have a conversation.
I think in terms of the vision and where we see we are headed, I think community-led conservation across different ecosystems, not only the forest, but as I was mentioning, deserts, sand dunes, coastal lagoons, high altitude pasture lands, Tarai Belt, like Northeast region, or islands of Sri Lanka, Maldives, pretext of Bhutan, Nepal, Central Himalayas. All these places, there had been kind of efforts and initiatives on working with the community for conservation. What we are doing is trying to generate a blueprint, building on what has already happened in those particular landscape. And we feel that the blueprint that we are generating is A, it is time relevant in current context. B, that this need is going to come in coming 10 to 15 years, that we will have to look at all the ecosystem for what they are. And in doing so, we need ready-made kind of blueprints on processes that can be adapted, tools, technologies that can be done. We need to have larger level of budgets that will be required so that countries such as Nepal, Bhutan, India, Sri Lanka, any in our countries, South Asia countries, if we have to go and expedite the process of leveraging more global finances for countries, we need to have absolutely critical data in terms of what exactly is the quantum that we need, who uses that resources, who implements it, who takes the ownership, how we are going to monitor all that kind of thing, right? And to do so, our vision is if we are able to cover at least one grassroots organization, two grassroots organization in different kind of magnitude. Some will be low touch model, some will be high touch model. But if we are able to synthesize this kind of blueprints in coming 10, 15 years for each of the eco-regions of South Asia, we would have GroundUp would have served its purpose. And that is the kind of work we are looking to launch most likely early next year, building upon the work that we have already done over the past 5 years, but thinking about covering this entire whole of the length and breadth of our continent, and seeing and giving the living examples, living laboratories where these sort of efforts are actually at play. And previous answer, right? So if the youth wants to go to some of these landscape where these kind of efforts are happening, train yourself, get the experience. And to do so, obviously, it is not the job of one individual or one organization. We are looking to those people who are at the present and at the precipice of this conundrum between community and conservation. Lands are limited, or funds are limited. They know that adaptation of climate change solutions are, and nature underpins some of those solutions. These people will resonate with what we are trying to say, me and Radhika, and what GroundUp is doing. And in that case, if you are a government entity, we are ready to listen, and share what has been our experience. What do we see? How we can solve that problem together. If it is a CSR organization, we have a portfolio of grassroots organization we are working with, championed by indigenous people, local communities. Women are there, youth are there. And should you wish to create biodiversity as one of your strong portfolio, we would be more than happy to support, not necessary to support our grassroots organization, but also if you are working with a grassroots organization or local organization who could benefit from some of the experience, either talking with us or through our leadership of grassroots, with whom we are serving, so that we don't have to start from the scratch, reinvent the wheel, use some of these things and take it. But also at the same time, organizations which are working on similar line and they have much refined experience than us, we also want to hear from them, especially if you have failures. So we want to remain active to listen and learn and adapt, as we are front facing towards the communities, and minimizing our risk would be very great. So if you have those kind of things, we would be more than happy to schedule a call, listen to your experiences, adapt some of your lessons into our ongoing landscape. I think individuals, because our work demands so much of a ground presence, we don't get so much time to host interns or people who want to do that part. But those people who want to really launch their career in this line of work, please write, and potentially we can schedule another call on just speaking about the career trajectories that the youth can actually take up in this line, and what are the potential opportunity, what kind of courses you can take, where you apply for, what are your exact exciting part about what you enjoy doing and things like that. So that can also be done. Beside that, I don't know who else, but question answers will, I think I will come, and then we can explain that part there also.
Great. Thank you so much, Swapnil. Anything you would like to add to that, Radhika? Anything you are seeing in terms of the future?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do at GroundUp is perhaps also be part of the larger narrative that is changing in conservation. That is to actually get on the ground and start, speaking and listening, more importantly, to people and shifting the focus. I think the future, I mean, as Swapnil has already mentioned, while we are intentionist, if we can develop these blueprints to actually work with organizations and communities on the ground, then there.
Hello?
I think again her internet must have stopped.
We can wait for.
Yeah, she's back. Go ahead.
I think the problems are very similar. It's just about, recentering what needs to be done and actually placing the people and the right stakeholders at the center, and then kind of, building things from there. And secondly, I also very strongly feel that, this is the time to make that shift before, obviously, anyways, we are way past tipping points. I don't, if things are not going to happen within the next 5 years, then things will not change, and it'll be too late to make any changes beyond that as well. And somewhere earlier we had also mentioned that there is a massive generational shift that is happening even among the communities, and every year we are losing that knowledge that was there. Every year we are losing that chance to bridge the knowledge that was there, the people that were there. If we are not able to make those shifts immediately, then I think it will be too late by the time within the next 10 years, it's going to be too late to come back to something that we should have done yesterday.
No, that's a great point. And I think talking about that anxiety that is there, especially among a lot of the youth of today, and this is a conversation that keeps happening in the climate space, of the anxiety of reaching that tipping point, and when do we reach it. So every 5 years we get a new report, we get some new scientific evidence saying that either we have already reached that stage or we are almost there, and that creates a lot of anxiety among a lot of people about what do we really do about this. How do we move forward from this, and what is something that can actually concretely affect these problems of our time. I think, like Swapnil, you mentioned earlier that you have been very lucky to have a lot of people in your team that have that kind of hope that is very much needed to work in this sector to kind of, challenge this while accepting that the scientific reality of us reaching that tipping point, but the hope that we need to continue working against it to kind of still circumvent that narrative. What kind of gives you that kind of hope, and your team especially, where does that hope come from, that this kind of large scale restoration is still possible in our lifetime, and this reconnecting with nature, the work that you're doing, why is that still possible in the lifetime of GroundUp especially?
Restoration as such is not new, look at in 1970s after the Great Depression, there was a great deal by Roosevelt. And until recently, that was the biggest restoration effort that was ever done. Tall grass prairies were restored at that time. Youth were mobilized. So many incentives were given that you look at your hedge plantation. There was a full army of ecological restorationists that would come. And greater example of USGS or US Wildlife and Fish Department, actually those lessons come from those kind of times, Look at China from earlier agriculture civilization to industrial civilization. Now they are moving into ecological civilization. Large scale restoration programs are being launched in China. Look at government of India's watershed program. That just started because water had become so acute as a problem, massive scale, the entire country level. It's a civil engineering undertaking of unproportionate volume. So many watershed structures were actually created. So restoration as such has always been the part and parcel. It's nothing new, and it will continue to happen because the surrounding forces will force us to think through this part. When you are saying that rivers are getting polluted, dengue and malaria are rampant almost in every tier 1 and tier 2 city, obviously we'll have to take a pause and think about think about the future, to look towards the future. And that pause will force us to reinvent ourselves and look at things that we completely took for granted. So large scale restoration as such, in a singularity, might not happen. It will happen in bits and pieces at the localized context, maybe at a block level, at the district level, at the state level. And these things will become the form of a government mandate in coming times. And people like us will be playing quite a small role in that case. It will be like a joint marathon between multiple organizations coming together, those who find alignment, those who can offer the flexibility, commitment, and also positioning that they will stand together with the government or with the parties with whom you disagree. That kind of coalition will be forming, and I personally feel that this is how things are going to emerge in sooner than later. To answer that part, large scale restoration, it will happen and it will be in bits and pieces, where these things will transform very quickly.
I think that's good, a good ending note for us. So I'll move us into the last question that we have for today. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot of things that people can take away from this conversation. But if someone listening today walks away with just one thought about GroundUp conservation, what do you hope that thought will be? Maybe Radhika, we can start with you, and then Swapnil, you can answer as well.
Right. I think what we would probably like people to take from this is that, GroundUp started with just the vision of, reshifting the focus and shifting the gears in the right places. And if we can kind of take back this narrative that, look, there is untapped potential on the ground waiting for us, and that's just something that GroundUp is working on. And there is a lot of room for everyone to work in here at the ground level itself. And if this is one thing that people can take back, that, maybe we need to just refocus ourselves and refocus ourselves in a way that we know we are talking to the right people on the ground, talking about the right things and also touching upon the right things. Then I think we would have, that is something that I would want people to take back, is that we are there on the forefront of the shifting narrative.
My concluding thing is also just simply building on what Radhika mentioned. She covered it beautifully. I think I just feel opportunity exists, paths are fairly clear. Time is the most important currency we need to trade. And action is more important than procrastination. And we need to use wherever we are, whatever we have, whatever time we are in, we need to assemble this all together and move into action. If we take the action, I think Earth will respond, and she will respond in the best way she knows how to respond, And yeah, this is the thing that I would say, this is the time. If not now, then when? If not us, by then who, That's a simple question.
I think those are really great thoughts to, end this entire interview on. I think from my end, there are the four main things that I will mention to our audience is that, after listening to all of this, I think because all of you will be coming from very different backgrounds, very different kind of age groups, experiences, landscapes. Some questions that can be takeaway questions for you to yourself think about is the four things that stood out to me from this conversation was that, are we involving the people who have that kind of sense of ownership about the landscapes that we are working at? Are those people involved in the right way and at the right time, especially? Second, for a lot of people who are already working, might be, how are we thinking about frugality? I think that's something that has come up a lot in this conversation. And are we really being frugal in the practices that we are envisioning, especially in the long term? Or are we practicing something that, while might be impactful in the short term, but might not lead to the kind of results that we're hoping for in the long term? So thinking about frugality in terms of our work and in terms of our practice is something maybe that some people could reflect on. Third, for I think being someone who is very early in my career and also be thinking about this entire space, which resonated with me a lot is thinking about hope and how we think about hope in terms of this entire conservation space. There's a lot of things out there that can be very depressing at times. So what do we really hold on to which gives us hope to continue working towards this direction, to continue hoping that the work that we do will actually get the results in terms of not just the people, but also in terms of rebuilding our relationship with nature. And I think the last thing, which is something that we've continuously practiced, me as a moderator, them as speakers, and you all as listeners, is listening and reflecting on everything that we are hearing. So broadening our group beyond just, our usual circles so that we get to listen to other perspectives that we maybe wouldn't have heard otherwise. And when we do hear it, to also reflect on our own positionality, on our own understanding, especially on our own biases. So maybe those are some thoughts from mine as a moderator that I would like all of our audience to keep in mind as we move towards the end of this session. But thank you so much for our two speakers today for sharing all of their time, all these stories and insights, and for all our listeners to being here continuously through this entire session and listening and joining us today. These conversations only matter because of the community that engages with them. So we're very grateful to have you as a part of this journey. If you would like to connect further, collaborate with us, or even just have a conversation like both Radhika and Swapnil mentioned, we would love to hear from you. You can reach out to us at GroundUp Conservation's email, or even over LinkedIn, you can reach out to any of us. Whether you're interested in engaging with our team, exploring partnerships, or simply just chatting about conservation. Together, we do believe that, as more people come together, we can really make a difference from the ground up. And maybe just also as a final note, we don't forget to follow our newsletter for regular updates. We do have a monthly newsletter where we provide a lot of details about the work that we're doing, and also something that we are looking more people to engage with. So definitely that's a space that you can keep connected with the work that we're doing on a regular basis. So again, thank you so much, Radhika, Swapnil, and we will again hopefully do this another time. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you. I thought you were just stopping the recording.